Loki had been away from Asgard for some time. He had been with the giant Angrboda, and when he returned, he had 3 children in tow. Jormungandr, the great serpent, frightened the Aesir so much that they threw him into the sea. And there he grew and grew until his body encircled the whole earth. Fenrir was a wolf, a great big wolf who was always hungry. And though the Aesir were afraid of him as well, they decided that they should keep him close. Tyr was the only one who was brave enough to go near him, and so it was Tyr who would bring food to Fenrir. And every day he would bring him meat, and every day in larger and larger portions, and each time Fenrir would say the same thing: "I'm so hungry." Hel was the only girl, and she was beautiful to behold, at least until she turned her head, and then you could look into death itself. Odin was less afraid of her, but he decided that she didn't need a place in Asgard, and so instead he brought her to Helheim, where she soon took dominion over the dead. Meanwhile, back in Asgard, Fenrir was growing and growing, and all the time he was more and more hungry. And the gods began to worry, because he was becoming so large that he was almost unmanageable. And what if he were to wander off and start eating things that he wasn't supposed to? There were prophecies, you see, and one was that Jormungandr would defeat Thor at Ragnarok, and the other that Fenrir would defeat Odin. And Odin was concerned about what would happen if left to his own devices. And so there was a meeting among the gods. They discussed and discussed at length until they decided the only solution was to bind Fenrir so that he could not escape and cause any harm. And so the gods searched and searched for a chain to bind Fenrir, and they came upon Lading. But none of the gods wanted to go near Fenrir, so the task fell again to Tyr. The god stood at a safe distance to watch what would happen as Tyr approached. "Good morning, Fenrir." "Good morning, Tyr. How are you today?" "Oh, I'm good." "Well, we've been noticing that you are getting so big and strong, and we thought, wow, if you're so strong, do you think that if we bound you, you could escape this chain?" And he held out Lading so that Fenrir could look at it. And Fenrir just snorted in derision and said, "Of course I can break through that." And so Tyr bound him in Lading. But Fenrir barely flexed, and the chain broke apart. "Wow, you're so strong," Tyr said. And Fenrir was excited and proud of himself. But the gods were not so happy. They retreated again to Odin's hall to discuss it. And they decided they needed to find a stronger bond. And so they pulled out their strongest bond, a chain called Dromi. And this one was much thicker than the other. And again they gave it to Tyr. And that next morning, he went out to meet Fenrir. "Good morning, Fenrir." "Good morning, Tyr. We were so impressed with the way that you broke that chain. We have a stronger chain here. This is Dromi. Do you think that you could break out of it as well?" And Fenrir smiled with big teeth, and he sniffed at the chain a little bit. And he said, yeah, I think I can do that. And so Tyr bound him again. And this time it took a little bit longer for Fenrir, but he flexed, and again the chain came to pieces. Wow, you're really strong, said Tyr. I can't believe you broke through Dromi as well. And Fenrir was so proud of himself. He said, yes, I'm very strong. And of course, the gods were not pleased about this at all. So they retreated again. And they weren't sure what to do, because Dromi had been their strongest chain. So they needed to find some other way to bind him. And they weren't quite sure. They discussed at some length. And finally, a solution emerged. They said, we'll go to the dwarves. They can create all sorts of things, and surely they'll know how to create a chain that's strong enough that Fenrir can't break it. So Freyr's messenger, Skirnir, was sent to Svartalfheimr to commission a chain, and the dwarves, they said it wouldn't be easy to make such a bond. It would require 6 impossible ingredients, and the ingredients were the sound of a cat's footsteps, and the beard of a woman, the roots of mountains, the sinews of a bear, and the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. So the gods went scoring everywhere, looking all over the 9 worlds, until finally they were able to track these things down and bring them to the dwarves. And from these items, the dwarves fashioned the fetter Gleipnir. It wasn't a chain, as was expected, but rather a very thin cord that was almost like a silken ribbon. And the gods were not sure how strong it could be, but each of them tested it, and none of them could tear it, so they decided to bring it to Fenrir. Tyr again approached Fenrir with Gleipnir, and said, "Good morning, Fenrir." "Good morning, Tyr. We were all so impressed with how you broke through Dromi and Lading so easily. Do you think you will give it one more try? Right here I have Gleipnir, and surely you can break free of this as well, this tiny little ribbon." Now Fenrir was not stupid. He peered down at Gleipnir, and it didn't look strong at all. But surely the gods wouldn't bring a weaker cord after he'd so easily broken through the other 2. So it had to be a trick. He paused, and then he said, "It looks to me like I will gain no fame by tearing this ribbon. It's slender, but if it were artfully made and with trickery, I don't wish to have it about my legs." And so the gods who were standing at a safe distance behind Tyr, they said surely he'd be able to break through this chain with his great strength, and then they asked if he was a coward. Fenrir looked at them haughtily. He growled, "If you bind me and I can't break free, I can tell by the distance that you're at that you surely wouldn't help me. And so, if I am going to wear this band, and you would question my courage about it, then which one of you would stick your hand into my mouth as assurance?" And of course, none of the gods wanted to do this. So, again, the task came to Tyr. He stepped forward and he said, "I'll do it." And so Fenrir cocked his head to one side and he said, "Very well." He opened his expansive mouth, and Tyr placed his hand inside. Tyr and Fenrir stood there, taking each other in, and for a moment the gods stood frozen, before springing into action and binding Fenrir with Gleipnir. And then they attached Gleipnir to the stone jewel, and anchored it with the stone fiti. And when this was done, Fenrir flexed, but Gleipnir held fast. He strained against the fetter, and still it didn't break, and he heaved with all his might. Gleipnir was not to be broken. He howled at the gods to release them, but they all stood well back, and none of them moved to his aid. And in a rage, he bit down. I wanted to start off with that instead of my usual introductions. But I'm Michelle. I'm from the blog Hearthside. And this is a retelling of the story of Fenrir, which is the topic of this blog. And I'm interested in the Skaldic retellings because each time this story is retold, then it can take on a different meaning. I have often found for myself that if someone is troubled, then telling them stories from the lore or from other mythology can be very helpful and calming and even help them sleep. And there's often lessons that are inside of it that you can take away and even apply to the modern world. So even my friends who aren't heathen, I quite often tell them stories of the lore because they're relatable, and this one is one of my favorites. One of the ones that I go back to again and again because I always see something different in it. When I've had troubles in my own life, I go back to this story, and there's so much to unravel here. First, there's Tyr. Tyr, who fed and raised Fenrir like a child or a pet, and grew to love him in his own way, who grew to care about him. And here he is, doing the hardest thing to protect the good of the tribe. No one else would stick their hand in Fenrir's mouth, but Tyr knew that if he didn't, something terrible could happen. And so he sacrificed a piece of himself in order to protect the tribe. The other thing that I see is Odin in the story. He knows the prophecy about Fenrir, and that Fenrir is supposed to bring about his demise, and so he's suspicious of Fenrir. But it seems, in a lot of ways, that because of Odin's suspicions, this prophecy fulfills itself, and that perhaps if left to his own devices, Fenrir would not have grown angry with the gods, and so might have not sought revenge against Odin in the end. But there is also the good of the community to consider. And even if Odin wasn't worried about self-preservation, Fenrir was getting too large, and he was very hungry, and he was very dangerous. It was only a matter of time before he got it into his head to go out and find something to eat that he shouldn't. So it's perhaps, although Odin was doing things, it seems, from a selfish perspective, he still was doing the thing that was right for the community as well. And then there's Fenrir himself. Wolves are such complicated characters in the myths and in the lore. And we see this in Odin's own two wolves, who they are almost more like hunting companions or even domesticated dogs. But then there's the other wolves. There's Fenrir, of course, and then there's the wolves that chase Sol and Mani about the skies, and some people say that they are the same as Fenrir. They certainly have the same hunger. So there's two different aspects. There's a plane. There's two different aspects of wolves within the lore, and one is this friendly version that can be helpful to the tribe, but the other version is the danger of the wild and the dangers of the unknown and that hungry animal nature that is outside of the Einhendr. And I think that if we look at wolves in this way, and particularly in the way of Fenrir as this hungry and unmanageable force, then we can apply that in many ways to our own lives. Because when you think about the culture of these heathens historically, they were living far up north. And in the winter, in order to survive, they had to retreat into their halls and stay inside most of the winter so that they didn't freeze to death or starve to death or be subjected to being eaten by wild animals like wolves. But beyond the wolves that were outside, there were also the wolves in the mind. And anyone who's lived up north for any amount of time understands that once the winter comes around and the dark closes in on you, that there are wolves inside as well. And these are the wolves that we would call, in the modern context, cabin fever. And they cause you to act strangely and more animal. People can turn against other people. So you have to know that those that are around you can be trusted. And then, of course, if we're looking at more modern times, we can think about the wolves that are in our own lives. These could be people who wish to harm us, or who are outside of our community and whose goals aren't aligned with ours. And for that reason, they're looking to get the most benefit out of whatever relationship they have with you, and not necessarily so interested in what your needs are. And of course, we do have wolves in our own minds. One of the most common wolves, of course, is fear. And sometimes we have to fight through the fear. Sometimes we have to look that wolf right in the eye to make sure that we're able to do things that will benefit ourselves and that will benefit our community. And sometimes we have to do the same with other people and stand there eye to eye with them so that they understand that you're on the same page and that each party deserves the same amount of respect. So, I guess some of the things that I take from this story is that you want to be like Tyr in the story. You don't want to be like Odin. Even though Odin makes the right choices, he makes them for the wrong reason, whereas Tyr is acting selflessly and for the benefit of the community. And though it's sometimes easy to feel like you can sympathize with Fenrir, you have to consider the dangers of becoming that wolf. So there's always more that I find in this story each time, and that's just some of the layers of it. And I'm sure that I'll write another piece on Tyr and Fenrir in the future, because, as I say, this is one of my favorite stories to go back to. I hope you enjoyed this interpretation of it, and I will see you next time.